let's start. So today we are going to have that heads-up SNC review thing. So the idea is to go through a few of the hand histories and pick some points out of those. So we have a few hand histories here. 18 games played by Vlada here, and as we can see, the result has been pretty decent overall. Okay, we could actually first check. There's not, of course, not big sample for this sort of positional report, but you can anyway check it out. And I think I have some sort of filtering here. So 500 hands, that's not much, but let's check about some main. So we are raising first 57 or 58% of hands and open limping 17%. So it's roughly 75% range. We check here with the flops still. So basically, when we talk about turbo heads-up play, my default range for open raising would be something like this. So pretty much you can open raise any suited hand and then fold around 20 to 15% of the crappy offsuit hands. That's pretty fine in my opinion. And basically the 75% will be meaning that we maybe fold some. And of course it always depends on the villains that we are playing against. If we are against the aggressive opponent, for example, then we can definitely open fold a bit more hands and so on. But villain hero here is playing quite a wide range, so I think that looks pretty decent. We will check about some of the specific situations probably later on about the certain spots. So we have some hand histories here, and I will mainly just go through some of them. I have pre-checked some game histories before, but not huge amount of these. So I think I can make it quite 3-player, quite sizable, so it can be easily seen at least. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, anything, use the chat, because now especially there is no added delay, so it's going to be easier. I have HUD here, but in most situations it doesn't matter that much. For open raise size, I think 2.5 big blind with the 75 big blind effective stacks is totally fine. And in general, when we go, I think when we even when we go to the next blind level 50 and 30, we can pretty much use the min raise from that point onward. And in here, basically, and if you have any opinions on the lines, hero play, or that I recommend, you can of course give your feedback. So in general, I would be checking back here. We can get value from some weaker hands, mainly straight draws, maybe some king high, but in general, we are going to do better by checking back and keeping his range wider. And we definitely don't want to face check raise, even though that should be pretty rare in these A high flops. And if he had a bet here, I would definitely call against most sizes. And once he checks again, we can definitely bet for value, because most of the time 9x or better would be betting, and check raising is quite rarely going to happen here. So that was well played hand. And these really crappy ones we can definitely fold. Here hero min raises, I don't know. I actually noticed this when I checked some of the histories, that hero is changing the open raise sizing sometimes. So in general, I'm not big fan of type of if the open raise size reflects your hand strength. That's definitely something you want to avoid. So I would use the same 50 here as well if that's my normal raise size. And in here we can definitely see bet like 30 or so. Well, half pot is fine, but we can use a bit smaller. And we'll lane raise. This is actually quite interesting situation, because basically, of course, Lane can sometimes have the deuce X. He might sometimes have some pocket pairs, but a decent amount of pocket pairs might also 3-bet pre-flop. So he's actually representing quite thin range here. So I would tend to call here and see how he continues. We still have gutshot, weak backdoor flush draw, and 2 overcards. So it's not the greatest spot ever, but I think we can definitely continue here. And hero folds. I'm not saying that it's big mix mistake, at least. But when we have the gutshot as well, I would call here. And it's kind of hard to believe the villain. Sometimes he has it, but deuce X is so rare. And if he has the 4x, we have anyway a lot of equity. And here against min raise, I would definitely defend 6-jack. It's not great hand, but against min raise, definitely good enough. We can fold like really crappy offsuit jacks, but I think 6-jack will still have decent enough playability. But yeah, I would probably fold like jack. At least jack 4, maybe even jack 5, but I think jack 6 starts to be good enough. Well, in here we can go either way by betting or checking. Usually I would just bet, because most of the time we have the best hand. But if we face check raise again, it's again kind of situation that villain is representing quite thin, and we don't really block any of his semi-bluff range either, so I would tend to be bet calling. And he calls. 5 is pretty crappy, especially club, because basically if he had some draw, it did improve, so I would just check here and be giving up here. It doesn't make really sense to go with that one. And then here 4-5 is good enough to call. I don't mind to mix in some 3-bet either. It's not horrible hand overall, because the thing is that when we play from the big blind, we have the great price in calling, so we don't usually we want to usually polarize the 3-bet range quite a lot. So hero, unfortunately, I think he wasn't able to come follow, because he sent message that he had some computer issues yesterday, so but he didn't want to change the timetable at this point anymore. Personally, oh yeah, standard. And we again used the min raise pre-flop, I think. And this will be pretty much check call. You don't usually want to do much of check raising in these situations, because the thing is that the villain has uncapped range, so he can have any AX, he can have any set. So
You can check raise something here. So if you have like 7, 10, 7 or some is 7, maybe ace 10, you can check raise that. Pockets set of 7s would be really nice to check raise, because you don't block anything that will then can continue with, and then you can mix in some of the straight draws, cutshots. But in general, in these sort of flops, when it favors somewhat for the button, I would mainly play by check calling. And kind of interesting spot in the river. We can definitely bet here sometimes to get value from 10 or queen x. The thing is that villain will often check back here if we check. But at the same time, it doesn't hurt that we have some of the AXs in the river check range, because then we have very easy check call hand. But I think main portion of time we want to be value betting AX here. And we definitely have some straight draws that we can bluff here as well. So that's also the reason that, because if we only value bet here, we basically with the like ace 10 plus 10, we don't really have that much value combos if we are 10 bluffing most of the straight draws. And he checks back. This time he had just busted straight draw and didn't bluff. Well, these are total crap. And obviously not folding anything against the min 3-bet. And has to fold that one. We don't have even backdoor flush draw or anything. It doesn't make too much sense to continue with dry a high. This is something that I'm not too big fan of, for the reason that I mentioned before. And the thing is that this hand plays pretty great as calling hand, but now that you 3-bet, you are going to tighten the mid lane range, so a lot of the hands that you were sometimes dominating will be mainly folding. And for example, hitting the queen x will have quite a bit decreased value compared to if you just call. And if you face 4-bet, it's also kind of nasty to fold this sort of quite solid hand. So personally, I would tend to polarize more the 3-betting range. Of course, with deep stacks you can mix in some of the like bit wider, but I think into this sort of hand doesn't make even much sense even in that case. And on the flop here, once the will lane call, we have basically two options. We can see bet small, like a bit over 100, maybe 120 or so. 100 is fine as well. Or other option is to check call, because this is basically the weakest queen x we will ever have, or should have in this situation once we have 3-bet. So it's because of that, it's actually quite nice hand to be check calling. And yeah, check call here make most sense. If we check raise here, well, some flush draws might call, but weaker made hands quite rarely tend to call. And basically here, if we just call here, it's 600, and pot would be 1650. So I just like to shove here mainly. If he has draw, he's going to be priced into call pretty much, and he's rarely going to bluff if we just call here. So yeah, this was finely played, but I think the pre-flop 3-bet is just a bit questionable one, and this play from the middle lane doesn't make sense that much. I mean, yeah, he can bet the flop with the plan to stack off, but I would be pretty happy to check behind in his shoes.
And then if the turn goes check, like if the hero check again, then I might try to make thin value bet with the main idea to check back river versus some AX type of hands, but yeah, now we are shallow stacked. That was the end of that. So I will go probably through some of these for a bit over an hour, and then maybe go through some of the filtered situations. So you have 3-6 suited standard open as default. We flop the sort of nuts without having the made hand, so betting like half pot around, or maybe around that would be my choosing. That is fine as well, because we are pretty deep stack, so bit bigger sizings make sense. And again here I would just flat and not 3-bet this sort of hand personally. One thing to say is that I rarely play this deep toe in the heads up and hello to Lapis. So I usually, if I play the heads up SNCs, it's going to be more about hyper type, or like in Unibet it's going to be 33 big blind deep. So I have to say that I don't have that much experience with deeper stacked heads up play, but like if we want to 3-bet somewhat wider, I would probably mix in some little bit stronger ones like Queen Jack suited, that we can also argue about. Like if the villain makes a 4-bet to 300, for example, we can still call with Queen Jack suited type of hand. But this, I think, it would be too thin to start calling against the 4-bet. Now, of course, 4-bets are probably quite rare in these $1.5 games anyway. So maybe we can just fold mainly without actually having really strong hand. But mainly I would 3-bet really polarized sort of range. So the value part and then the sort of more clearly bluffy parts, like some 5-7 shooters type of stuff. And because the thing is that when you 3-bet this sort of hand, villain is always pretty much going to continue with any sort of hand, like better Queen X, for example, hands that dominate your hand. But if he's going to have like weaker Queen X, some 9-7 off, that sort of hands, they are mainly going to fold. So that's the biggest minus in my book. I think this flop is quite close, that it's quite coordinated, so our fold equity is not huge, so we can definitely check fold here, but I don't mind c-betting either, because there are decent amount of, like, for example, if the king comes, jack comes, we can then definitely think about double barreling. Yeah, I don't think check folding is bad either overall. Yeah, these are turbo speed, so it's a bit deeper. But if you think about heads ups in general in other formats, for example in 6max SNC or MTT or whatever, it's usually going to be more about something like 20 to 30 big blind poker. In here I would also defend and sometimes 3-bet. I wouldn't usually fold against the min raise. It's pretty solid hand still. And I usually would open this one as well. So yeah, this seems to be standard 3-bets. 3 bets to hero. Now we flop the nuts. I would just check raise here. We are really deep stacked, so, and there are some turn cards that might kill action if the villain has like top pair or better here. So mainly check raising here, and sizing wise I think something around 100 or so would be fine. And this is pretty clear c-bet. We have quite a few. I would use a bit smaller sizing, so it's still quite dry flop, so no need to use 2/3 of the pot. And 10-6 I would also defend most of the time. And yeah, when he uses over 4x, almost 5x sizing, then definitely we have to fold this one. Yeah, it depends, like Lap is saying about that it's mainly push or fold, but you can still have limping range, for example, for 10 big blind deep quite nicely. But yeah, it's quite rare that both villains have over 20 big blind, that's true. I think against this 1/3 sizing I would check call here, but obviously the downside is that there are quite a few cards that are going to be good for us, so I don't think check folding here is bad, but like if he had made half pot here, I would tend to be folding most of the time. I think it's quite close against 1/3 pot. But this is pretty much the problem, that he continues betting and he might still be ahead, but he has a ton of better value hands as well. And even if he is semi-bluffing, he tends to have a lot of equity. But of course, we only need again 21% to call, so I think if you call the flop, it's probably fine to call this one as well. But again, if he had sized it even a little bit bigger, I would be folding. And this is actually kind of interesting spot in a way that we might, I would say, some point in turning this hand into bluff here and bet like 240 or so here and represent mainly King X. Thing is that if you want to bluff here, we basically don't want to have the spade, because we want villain to have spade. So I think this sort of hand that doesn't really beat much at all in the showdown either is quite reasonable to turn into bluff here. Now he bets small, so again here calling would be the worst option in my opinion. Even though the pots are great, but I mean, how this hand has gone, he can definitely value bet like any 2 pair with this sizing. So again, I would probably mainly fold here, sometimes make that raise to 350 or something like that. Hero call here, and he has Jack 9. So he's value betting decently weak, his 2 pairs basically. And he was value betting flop and turn with tiny bit better pair basically.
4, we are 30 big blind deep. I would call here pretty much always. And we can just check fold this flop. And crystal clear check call. And going for value would be a bit too thin here. So I would just check call mainly, because this is going to be pretty high on our checking range. We would quite often, maybe we sometimes check like if we have something like queen 5 off or something, but mainly queen X or better will be value betting here, so it would go for check call range. Well, I don't mind limping, but in general, personally, I tend to use very little open limping, like deeper than 30 big blind deep. Yeah, my default, as Lapis was asking here in the chat, my default would be to raise pretty much every hand I want to play here. And if the villain is sort of player that he's aggressive, then we can adjust to it. But if we face here like at least up to 3.5 pp raise, I would definitely limp call after limping. This is pretty strong hand overall. Has good amount of playability. And yeah, I think we want to just bet here. We have some showdown value, but not huge, and we should have good fold equity. Of course, downside might be that some players might call most of the better hands actually, but we can definitely get some Jack 10 or Queen X to fold as default. And if there is like 9 or 8 or 10 for example, we can definitely double barrel. This is actually a situation that villain is probably going to c-bet, and if we look about the stats, so far he has been c-betting every time. Of course only 5 hands. But this is flop that he's going to c-bet really often, so I would probably often go for check raise, like raise to 120 or so. We don't need to go big because this is extremely dry flop. And some other hands I could use would be like 5-3 suited, 5-6 type of hand. That would make sense as check raising. And then the point is that if we do this sort of play, we also need to be check raising decent amount of top pairs so that we have balance in the range. Oh yeah, I think the sizing is good here, and I mean we can go quite face up here in a way that if the turn is total blank, that we don't turn any equity, we can just give up this one and more preferably use those 5-6 type of hands that still have the gut shot at least. But if we don't turn any equity, then we can definitely just check fold if we'll then continue here. So we limp again. I would call here. There is decent chance that our hand is the best or that Queen or 10 is good, and we can definitely turn some straight draw equity that we can then decide to sometimes raise as well if the villain bets or if the villain check and turn is like 9 or ace, or well, you can decide then that do you want to just check for showdown, for the showdown value, or try to represent decent mate hand. But I think folding is maybe a bit on the weak side. I think I would tend to use just 3x sizing if I 3-bet pre-flop, and one thing to note here is that if you do 3-bet and we lane shove, we kind of have to stack off, because we are going to have quite decent potters at that point. This is definitely option to do. More often I would probably personally just call, and use like king queen or so as 3-bets, but king jack is definitely fine as well. But just that you have to stack off 3-bet folding would be pretty absurd most of the time, unless you think that will lane only shoves extremely strong hands. So here I don't actually mind either way. We have decent top pair, so raising for value is definitely fine, but also as calling this is quite good because we have the backdoor flush draw. We have like if the turn is something like 8 or 10, then we get some straight equity as well. So I think either way it's fine here. But now we definitely want to bet for value like 100 or so. And seems like at least this time will lane range was somewhat weak. I would doubt that the will lane is folding like any queen or jack excess least, so probably some sort of weirdly played 7x or some cut shot or something along those lines quite often. Well, I would just flat here. Shoving is, well, it's probably going to be plus EV, but we can actually check what the hold'em resources would think about. I have actually checked this exact hand on before, it seems. So we lane is min raising, we are shoving, and I think it was with the chip EV in big blind. So if the villain is open raising any two, we are going to make decent profit. So with 1.25 big blinds, if the villain calls with 25% range. I think this is going to be more often a bit too wide calling range, considering we are shoving 30 big blinds. So I would expect it to be more often something around this than 25%. Also, we can probably have some data on this guy, 29 hands. He has open raised 60% so far. So let's say that he's opening maybe 65%. This range construction is quite interesting. So yeah, something like that would probably make a bit more sense. Well, so let's say that it's 66%. So with that sort of assumptions, it's still going to be somewhat half big blind plus EV. But mainly I would still flat, because thing is that if we 3-bet shove a standard this deep, when you get called, you are mainly going to be behind. So sometimes he might be calling like some strong Broadway hand that we are 55% favorite roughly. But mainly we are going to be way behind when the call comes. So we are risking huge pile of chips to win small spots, or run into something and play huge one with bad equity. But yeah, if we have option of folding or shoving is often going to be better option. But yeah, flatting would be my standard. If we had like bit over 20 big blind, I would see much more profit in just shoving at that point, because we would be risking way less overall, way smaller stack depth. And mainly I would use just like smallish pocket pairs for that sort of play. It seems like we are mainly limping quite a lot against this guy. He has been folding in these samples 4 out of 7 times against the steel, so it's not like he's not folding anything. So I would just continue raising mainly personally. Here actually on the flop I don't mind betting, because we don't have that much showdown value, and then we actually have quite a lot of double barreling possibilities with the backdoor draws. But yeah, checking is not bad either. I think here we want to bet and deny some equity, but I mean, if we had bet flop, it would be way easier for us to represent flushes and so on, and go for triple barrel sometimes, in my opinion, and represent some like 2 pair and such. This is a hand that we can go again either way, but it's really dry flop, and one thing to note here is that again, when we have the 9 of clubs, there aren't that many bad turn cards overall. So, but he also uses pretty smallish sizing, so more often I would just check call and use some bit better, stronger 10x as check raise, like king 10 or something. But I don't think check raising on the flop anyway would be absurd by any means. Yeah, I think we want to just use this as check call. There is some merit in making small bets and hope that he calls with some, but it's kind of like when he bets small flop and check the turn, how often he has like any 2 pairs. Of course 7-9, 9-8 type of hands are plausible, but he might try to value bet those against the check as well. So I think I would tend to go toward check calling. And that one would be decent defend as well. This we can go either way. I would probably check more often. We have decent showdown value, and again, any AX is not going to fold. King X might not. And I don't want to face check raise either that much, so. And here just trying to check to showdown would be the. And now we actually hit the top pair, so definitely value betting like 100 or so. We don't want to go really big, in my opinion, because it's really tough for Willen to have much here. So I think half pot 100, that would be the. Oh, so I would say that this is a bit too much in general. And it's also kind of interesting to ask that what hands we would use as bluff, because we should be checking back king high, a high. Any pocket pair like deuces, for example. So maybe we could have sometimes as bluff with some sort of 9 high or something like that. But the point is that we don't really have that many bluffs either, so I would prefer smaller sizing. And it's kind of questionable, would Willen bet the turn with 5x or 6x? I personally would be value betting those main portion of time. So we are basically mainly trying to get value from a high, I would say. Maybe some 5x's. And now we shove again. Not the biggest fan of that move. And yeah, betting is fine here. Good defend. I would call here. We have some backdoor straight potential. So against 1/3 of the bet size, and he has been c-betting pretty often or always. So I would definitely call here. And this is actually interesting turn spot. Do I have the c-bet turn? So, well, we don't have much of a sample, obviously. So far he has c-bet always and c-bet turn 1 out of 3 times. In general, this turn is pretty great, or it's going to improve our range way more than the will lanes, in a way that will lane should mainly check behind with the 4x. So this would be a reasonable spot to donk bet. And if dog betting, I think something like around half pot would be quite reasonable. We can mix in some or like 200. We can then mix in some of the semi bluffs. And well, some people also use sort of strategy in these situations that they might even donk bet all of their hands with really small sizing, with the idea that if they check, we'll lane check behind mainly, and by betting even like some 8x, they basically deny some equity from some random overcard type of hand. But yeah, Euro check here. Well, I think we want to just mainly check raise here. And sizing wise, I think around 350 or so would be fine, or 300. So now we are somewhat shorter stack, so now limping would be my default play with this hand, because if you min raise and face shove, it's going to be somewhat awkward situation that do you want to stack off or fold. So to prevent that situation, I would be limping as default. If the villain is really nitty, then I might just min raise fold, but this would be the normal line. And we have some backdoors here, so if we had like queen 10 of spade, I don't mind folding, but when we have the backdoor flush, I would definitely call here. Oh, that is crappy card, and he bets big, so easy fold. And don't mind this play. I think on the flop we can just check behind. We have some showdown value and not really much turns that we would want to double barrel, so. But now we can definitely value bet smallish. Or well, we can basically bet quite big in a way that it's unlikely that villain has better, but at the same time you want to ask that. I would probably go a bit bigger than 50, but something like 80 chips or something like that. Because if the villain has like 8x, I think he's quite often calling a bit bigger sizing as well. Well, this is mandatory 3-bet shove. Well, again, not big favorite of this one. We are almost 20 big blind deep, so We want to get action from weaker hand by shoving here. Well, sure, villain can call weaker hands, but he's going to mainly fold a huge portion of those weaker hands. And I mean, ace-8 still has decent playability. We can flop a lot of top pairs, mid pairs with the 8x. And villain did call 10-jack suitors. I think this is actually kind of interesting question. That what do you guys think about that call? Would you make it against someone who has not been open shoving really? Villain is my 18 big blind deep. So if I put the hand on the hold'em resources, so yeah, in here we have the Nash ranges. If the hero shoves 41%, 10 jack 10 suitor is going to be actually exactly break even. And you can usually say that, of course, when hero shoves, he doesn't have these really good hands most of the time. Most of the time, probably, so we can at least somewhat cut those. But I would say that, especially when the villain has been quite passive, so I don't really see any point really to be shoving wide. So I don't know what sort of range we could have. But to be honest, I wouldn't expect much wider than something like this. At least at that point it's somewhat minus EV, so it's tough to be like absolutely horrible call, of course, because you still have huge amount of equity with hand, but I would say that it's most of the time going to be somewhat minus EV. Of course, nasty to be folding hand like that, but this seems to be pretty short one. So I would imagine that we are not shoving here at least. And this might look weak to check. But I actually don't mind this play overall, because ace-5 is not the hand that you want to play out of position on bigger pots, basically. So by checking, you allow yourself to have some AX. Yeah, I don't like the shove that much. I mean, small pocket pairs you can open shove definitely, but yeah, this is just checking hand, and quite good to note that villain doesn't bet here. So when he doesn't bet this sort of hand, we can definitely assume that this guy is passive, at least on the semi-bluffing parts. And right away he bets pot here. Well, we have a really strong top pair, so I don't mind either way. If we just call here, we keep his range wider, maybe keep some weird air balls. Of course, it's after that first hand. This would imply that he probably has something made hand more often, but we can definitely stack off here also by just raising. So the ace, the question is that good or bad card for us? And I would say that it's pretty much blank one. So it's somewhat unlikely to improve nitro of the player overall. So I don't actually mind betting here either. We can definitely still get some value from draws and such. That now that we have the trips, we can definitely bet. Question is, what is the sizing? Of Of course, if the villain has busted straight draw or something like that, we probably don't get value with any sizing. But it's unlikely that he has the 10x either most of the time. And if he has one, he might be check raising it also. So we usually don't use any value against 10x, even if we use small sizing. Yeah, I think, as I said about the king 10 on the flop, that I think either way it has good sides. But yeah, we have to bet here. I would go like maybe something like 350, 400, because the point is that we are actually trying to get value from 8x quite a lot, even though it doesn't really make too much sense that villain has 8x when he donk bet spot, but whatever. So I think we want to go on the smaller side in general, and hero solves here, which is of course fine from our hand strength point of view, but I would just question that how often we actually get call. And of course, like, if we think that this shove gets the fold, we can definitely bluff with this sizing as well, quite a lot. So I'm not saying that this is a mistake, but in overall, but as default, without having any hero call reads from the villain, I would personally prefer a bit smaller. Well, personally, I would go smaller here, but it doesn't make too much sense for our overall range to be putting deuce. So villain call, we can usually say that he has at least a high. He might have some pocket pairs, maybe sometimes like king jack type of hand, and then rarely the quads. So mainly we should be checking back here. I would say it's not horrible idea either. I would say to bet like 100 with the plan to try to buy the free showdown with it. Like sometimes we might get some a high to call again. And then he bets spot. Well, the thing is that he shouldn't really have the 8 or 6 that often. So I think it's actually kind of tough to believe. Kind of tough to believe. So I would probably hero call here as played still. Of course, in a way we can argue about folding also, because like if the villain has a high, he should be mainly checking, in my opinion. So it's actually quite hard to see pure bluffs here unless villain is calling like those random 2 overcard hands like queen jack or something like that. But yeah, this guy seems quite wild. So, but this call would be a lot easier, I would say, if we had made smaller c-bet on the flop. But we made the pot size, so it makes this probably a bit more nasty to call. And he actually had the quads. I wouldn't mind actually bluffing on the river here. We have worst possible hand pretty much. And in these 4 flush card flops, it's often that you can't really have like meaningful blockers overall. So it usually makes most sense to just, if you bluff with the bottom of your range type of hands. Well, personally, I would tend to check back, but check flop often, but I don't think betting is bad either. I think on the turn, this looks like sort of blocker bet that we are trying to buy decently priced river, because I wouldn't expect much of fold equity with this sizing, so I think against passive opponents we could also just check and see if we get the free river or if we want to bluff. So my bluff again, then use bigger sizing, like something like 70 chips or so, and put some pressure against like 6x or some. You might even have some king high type of hand or 10-8 or whatever. But yeah, usually you don't want to bluff with the flush draws that much, even if we block the straight draw. So I think this would be the kind of most reasonable busted flush draw that you could argue about bluffing, because as I said, you block those nuttiest hands basically. Oh, top pair. And this guy bets pot. Well, we don't have quite a strong top pair. I would often just call here. And now definitely betting. We have the trips, so most of the time best hand. Of course, it can be kind of awkward if the villain check raises, but there are still a lot of bad cards to come, possible to come, like 5 or 6 or somewhat nasty. Any heart. So we need to protect our hand here. And this is the nasty department. How would you play? So basically villain is check shoving here. I think we can take like one thing we want to consider in this situation is that villain has been making pretty weird looking lines, making those pot size bets and so on, donk bets. So one thing we want to ask here, is it possible that villain is making this for value with the weaker hand, and I think at least some weaker 8x might beat here. I don't know if he would be wise enough to use 7x XFS check raise, check shove for value, who knows. But in general, when we are against fizzy looking opponent, I'm not usually making too big of a hero folds, because they can have some stupid bluffs, they can do some stupid things with made hands, so I wouldn't love the situation, but I would be stacking off here. And he had a bit weaker trips this time. Well, yeah, we are only 3 big blind deep, so yeah, shoving is the standard tier. So let's take, I think, 2 more games perhaps, and then take few of the points that I prepared couple or 2 different quick filters for hand filtering, so we can look about couple things. This is kind of close, I suppose, in a way, but problem here is that we don't really have a way to improve into any meaningful hand, in a way that if the villain has the AX, he's going to be behind on any river anyway. So I would tend to fold here because we can definitely have some one pair hands that can still improve to two pairs. For example, I would be much more happy to call with like 8-7 here than king high. But we do call, and check folding is the only option pretty much. And villain actually has the ace but isn't value betting. I think that's quite passive, even though it's the not low ace. That looks good. Yeah, this guy has straight. So he doesn't bet turn with the straight, and he doesn't bet the river with the straight. Well, we have obviously one weird guy. Well, actually seems like we have before hands on this guy, and he seems to be quite a wild with 3 bets overall. Of course only 13 hands, but there is some merit in defending these. You can also sometimes 4-bet in a way that this doesn't have that much post play ability. These weak offsuit aces. I don't actually mind pretty much any option here. So 4-bet shoving, I don't think that is really good option, because we are still 67 big blind deep pretty much. So even if the guy is wide, we can't really stack off crappy ace that deep. But he calls, we suck out. This is actually quite close. Pocket deuce is 16 big blind. I think if we look about Nash range in the heads up equilibrium, it would be up to 15 big blind, but at the same time villain range is somewhat capped, so I think folding isn't horrible, but calling isn't a mistake either. Yeah, we are quite shallow stacked here, so check raising isn't that, and if the villain is sort of crazy guy, he might not get too much credit for it anyway. And well, I don't know if calling would be somewhat reasonable. We can have some showdown value with check high, but it's not too much, so I think folding is quite reasonable. So it seems like we are pot controlling in a way that we probably expect this guy to be making some wild plays. 4-5 I would still tend to defend. Of course, against this sort of player, it cannot be somewhat closer if we assume that he's going to barrel us heavily, so it's so rare that we are actually hitting anything really strong with the 4-5. This would be actually quite decent hand to be raising as default, if you think that you can get the button folding something. And we have seen that he shoves a lot of against our limps, so I would limp call this hand. We have done a lot of limping, so would prefer that limping option here as well. And this is actually quite interesting spot. Can we call? So we still have the gut shot, but at the same time our hand is not going to improve often, and getting further action is going to force us to fold mainly. So I think we can fold here as well, but probably not big mistake either way. So we are 30 big blind deep here, will let us use 3x sizing. One thing to note about this guy, at least in this sample, is that he's haven't been raising actively that much. So we shove here. Let's actually check this. Of course, we only have 40 hands. Oh, that was the wrong button. That was the wrong button. So he had still been raising quite. No valid history. Not sure what was it this one or? Why the heck I clicked that button? Closing the replayer and I clicked the whole program down. That's one way to screw the stream. Well, anyway, it was around 30 big blind deep. If we put something like this here and put him to raise 3 big blind. And he seems to be passive from that sample, so let's say that he's raising only 50% in reality, roughly. We are still going to make some profit, at least with the crappy offsuit ace. Well, anyway, let's go to if this was or wasn't. I think it was the upper, and perhaps I don't know if anyone is that interested about the end result or not from that game, but It was probably this one. Yeah, this seems familiar. Yeah, basically, if we tighten the range further, then it would start to be minus EV. But yeah, not unreasonable. Not unreasonable play, especially against the 3x sizing, if we don't read any extra strength on it. I would tend to look for check raise here, maybe. But if we don't bet some draws, then this one is pretty fine as lead for value, and obviously can't fold. Wow, this is pretty weird looking bet. I suppose in theory wise we should be snap folding here, but at the same time, like, would he play flush like this? Or of course it might be that he has like bigger 10x or some 10-8 or something that he min raised the flop and now overprotects it. Okay, that ended here. Had to check to make sure that I don't again click the wrong X. Yeah, it was really weird one. Like that is really like, what do you feel about your opponent? If you think that he's just some total crazy weirdo, you can definitely hero call, in my opinion, but it would be against any sort of, I would say, any sort of theory side pretty heavily. So I think this was actually the same opponent than the game before we checked. Well, I wouldn't usually raise this sort of hand against the limp again, and especially against this. If at this point hero had to read about the villain, we might face some limp 3-bets quite easily as well. Yeah, that seems standard. Yeah, well, I think we can go either way on the flop, and definitely stacking off if the villain wants that. So I would probably just 3-bet here. Sizing wise, well, I think we could make argument about smaller sizing, but basically, if we want to shove here, if we have like some 2-pair or set, then yeah, this makes sense to shove as well with this one. obviously with that strong of a draw, it's definitely not issue to stack off, and his play is obviously pretty optimistic one. But of course, like in a way, against that sort of guy, you can also play pretty exploitative here on the flops, that you mainly just 3-bet when you have the good, and because he also gives great price for your draws to continue by calling, so you can also play like pretty honest in a way, that just call for the pot odds with the draws and sip it when you have it. Balancing against that sort of guy is not going to be important at all, basically. So yeah, let's take at least this one and then look about those spots. Again, this hand I wouldn't be really raising against the limping. We could use a bit smaller sizing as well. Menepäs Niko.
Näyttääkää kamerasta. Hei! Hei!
Nephew coming to watch. Well, I think I would just call here and go from here. Stacking off with the sixes would be somewhat optimistic. And yeah, just checking and folding the river. And yeah, a bit smaller sizing on this sort of flop would make sense. Yeah. He wants to often come to watch when I am streaming or playing, but during the streams it's a bit problematic. Of course, can't really fold here. Now it's a bit more awkward, but you need to be good 1 out of 4 times. I think folding would be somewhat, I don't know, maybe tight. So it's quite tough to think about that sensible bluffs, like maybe some 5-6 would make sense. But if you have an assumption that you are against some totally recreational player or unknown, I don't mind to call. I would expect to be behind more than half of the time, but you only need to be good 1 out of 4 times. And when they show up with this sort of hands, that's definitely going to happen. Lap is probably set wrong way, I suppose. If the villain is complete maniac, we can happily call, but if he seems solid, we probably don't want to be. And this is one of the problems, like if we raise these sort of hands, it's nice hand, but, and especially as I think this guy had done the limp 3-bet, though it was limp min 3-bet before or something, but I would again say that polarize more on the when you raise against the limps as default. And folding grabby king against 3x is definitely definitely fine. No. Not sure what hand we were on, but I think this was the familiar one at least. Well, play for limp flop check is fine, but when we lay min bets here, we have got such one overcard. I will call here and take the cheap draw. I'm definitely defending against min raise, check calling flop. And probably check calling against this guy on the turn as well. And on the river, we can go either way. I would say value betting isn't bad with the good kicker 6x. This is definitely check back on the flop. And on the turn, I would usually bet. We have the best hand so often when we'll then check again on the turn. And now, again, kind of situation that if the villain has the busted draw, we don't really get much, but if he has something like 7x, he might hero call. So I would go for like, I think around 200 would be somewhat reasonable. And we get call from king high. That seems standard. Bigger sizing pre, like I would generally use 3 big blind at least, but like even 3.5 big blind is totally fine. Fine with when you raise the limper on the bottom, because he gets pretty nice pot odds even against the 3 big blind. Actually something that I didn't mention before, I think, so you can definitely go. The 3 big blind is actually the minimum I would tend to use, and quite often 3.5 big blinds. And in here I would just check on the flop and go from here. You're not going to get any better hand to fold by betting at least one street. And this guy can make a lot of weird stuff, so and in here I would usually just call to keep his bluffs in the game. And now go for the bet, because if he has total air, he's probably not bluffing on the river either anymore. So yeah, I think these were all $1.5, so I think it's like second lowest on the Poker Stars. And basically in here on the turn, like sizing wise, I think this is a bit too small, so you want to think about what sizing you bet that you get a nice shoving situation on the river. So if you make, like with this sizing, we get like bit over pot size on the river, which is kind of too much for my opinion, like for optimal type of situation. So I would bet like bit more, like 100 more here. So villain would have 100 less 800, and the pot would be 1000. So we would have quite nice stack depth at that point for the river sum.
And yeah, that was pretty weird guy. So let's at this point look about those. So hand reports, and I did make, yeah, I think one one point about the 3-bet. So I have filters here that we have raised against the steel, and effective stack is more than 20 big blind. So basically I just wanted to point out in this about those sizings and type of hand. So basically if you look about this list of hands here, and well, as we saw before, Hero is doing 3-bets with deep stacks with these sort of Queen 8 suited, but I think we would want to see more about polarized stuff. So there should be more about that we have more clearly value hands, and then some for example this sort of 8-4 suited, 4-3 suited. But let's go through some of these. Well, this was pretty standard. Shove spot. Well, these are, as we checked, it's going to often be somewhat plus EV. But one of the issues that when you shove here, I don't know if I mentioned before, but the thing is that if you shove, like let's say ace or shove or 3-bet smaller with like ace 10 plus for value, and then you shove these crappy aces as sort of free steal, then you don't actually have that many AXs in the flatting range, and that's going to be somewhat of issue. But I'm not saying like it's there are definitely some good things, like yeah, most of the time it's somewhat plus EV, hand plays crappily or quite badly post flop, and you are going to get into situations where you have sort of actually not sure if you can, if it was possible to use this Flopzilla. In a way that, yeah, I think it was that it doesn't, or if I take some ace-3 off here, yeah, I think there wasn't sort of crap. But the point is that the ace is often going to be in decent shape against wide range on good amount of flops, but the problem is that it's going to be a lot on the sort of gray area, that your A high is actually good, but there is not that much chances to improve the hand, and you don't really want to see that many or lot of certain type of turn river cards. So it's going to be, because of that, kind of tough to play in a way. But as mentioned before, that we also risk so much that when we get called, we are going to be screwed. And this was, again, I would prefer a bit bigger sizing when we do 3-bet, but not use that sort of hand. So if we use the Flopzilla to think about what sort of range we would want to be 3-betting. So let's say that we maybe want to 3-bet stack off with some sort of pocket pairs like that. Then we have some, for example, here we were around 50 big blind deep. So maybe the 3-betting range is going to be something like that for, well, I don't know if we want to 3-bet stack of king queen off that much, but maybe the value part is something like this. Then I would personally take, at least with shallower stacks, I would often make my range so that I would add some of these sort of crappy hands here for the bluff combos. So if we look about combo amount, so we have 82 combos of value, and then if we add some of these, you don't need to have huge amount of those. So now we would have like 2/3 of the range for value and some 1/3 for the sort of bluffy hands. Personally, I maybe prefer a bit more of these sort of suited hands because they still have more close to playability, and when you are out of position, you are often getting caught a bit more. So you want to have some playability. So at least this is sort of way how I would tend to respond. But in a way, you can of course mix in with deeper stacks, because in the deeper stack situation, the thing is that you're not going to face that much 4-bets in general. So in a way, you can mix in some of these like hands from here. But the problem is that if you start to face the 4-bets, then if you are forced to fold those sort of hands, then it's quite a disaster. So basically, it depends like how deep we are, that how wide our value range is, and then how much we can sensibly put those bluff combos in here. And the good things, in my opinion, also about these sort of hands is that, like, if the hero was 3-betting Queen 8 suited type of hand, is that it's going to be way more easily dominated this Queen 8 compared to these smaller suited connector or gabber type of hands. So at least that's how I would be creating those ranges. And here we were a bit like 30 big blind, so it's reasonable to 3-bet that one as long as we are stacking off. But of course, like, it depends also, if you have bigger sample on the opponent, you might have a data that Willing is 3-bet raise folding too much against the 3-bets, and then you can try to abuse it more. Well, this is actually a situation that we are only 20 big blind deep, so 3-bet shoving is definitely clearly plus EV, but I don't actually hate just calling here as well, because you definitely want to have some AXs in the flatting range with these 20 big blind stacks. So by calling, you have 10, your range is going to be more protected on the AX export. And especially suited hand has more post playability compared to, like, if it was A6 off. And here again, sizing wise, this is just too small. Like, yeah, we have good hand that plays from position, not from a post of decently well, but in here we just give such a absurd pot odds for Willing to call pretty much anything. So we don't really want to give that possibility for Willing from position. And then, because 2/3 of the time this sort of hand is still going to miss the flop, and then we are often going to be in somewhat awkward situations. So I would say that good main line is to use the 3x when you are
in this sort of situation, for example. And with the deeper stacks you can even go bit bigger, but without antes I don't see too much point in making like 4x, unless you are deeper stacked like 100 big blind, but that's not going to happen in these games. And for example in this spot, well, this is actually kind of good example in my opinion, that again I would use bit bigger sizing overall, but when you are deeper deeper stacked, like we are 45 big blind around, so it's going to be less often that we face 4-bet, so in a way this sort of 3-bet makes sense, but you want to also think about before 3-betting that are you willing to stack off pre-flop, and how likely do you think that the villain is 4-betting. And basically one more thing about filtering situations, I would check about those situations that we face limp. I think villain hero is another area where this south was totally fine with 7s. It's another area where hero is making, and this is actually play that I don't mind that much, so I would again tend to use bit bigger sizing. And this doesn't make too much sense, because now we basically force villain to fold anything weaker, almost at least, so it's going to be better to bet smaller and call against the shove, or perhaps check sometimes, but and yeah, this would be just call for me in general. And yeah, that board hits villain range quite often. And for example, this sort of hand doesn't make too much sense in my opinion. Again, Jack 7 is going to be quite easily dominated against the hands that call, most likely raise call, and so it would be better to have for example like 7-6, 8-7 suited. That also has some better playability if you get called, and this looks pretty wild. I would just call here most of the time. And yeah, we are deep enough to just 3-bet to 300 or so and go from here. So yeah, I think that's the main point about those. We actually checked almost all the hands anyway. Then there was I think this was the filter. So basically I filtered here situation that we are on the big blind. There has been limp, and we have raised pre-flop, and effective stack size is over 15 big blind. So for example here, if we look about this, but this was one of the things that I definitely wanted to point out, that when we check these hands, we don't really have the sort of hands that I would often use, like those smaller connectors, suited connector hands, which I would often use as sort of light race against the bottom limps. So That's one thing to consider using more. And I think the reasons have been said a couple times. And again here, like we are 25 big blind deep bit over, so at least 3 big blind, 3.5 would be fine as well. And I think we actually looked this hand. I would go for check call line here. And basically on the turn, well, blocking the ace of spade is not such a problem, but queen is kind of bad card to have, because we want Ville to have sort of queen 10, queen check that he might might try to bluff. And here 3.5, I think it's fine. When we are this deep, I think even 4 big blind would make some merit. And yeah, this was actually also the hand that we had earlier against the maniac sort of guy. Again, this sort of hand I wouldn't tend to go, because again, how good you are against the villain range when he does limp call, or if this happens, it's kind of disaster. And definitely this sort of hand, do you want to float the pot out of position with queen 9 off when you have the option to just check for free flop and keep the pot small, being out of position? So for me it would be really easy decision to just check. And I don't think c-betting here would be bad, because of course villain can more easily hit here, but it's still quite low board, so most of the time it has missed the villain also. This is quite similar to queen 9 off before. And aces, definitely I would be c-betting here. We can get value from a lot of weaker hands and need some protection. And I mean, villain having better hand is not going to be that often the case, because most players wouldn't play like any 2 pair hands as limp call type of line pre-flop. And as played, we should be betting the turn for value. This was pretty weird. I suppose now we can't really value bet anymore. And actually kind of interesting to, or it's actually reasonable that he checks back the 9x in a way, but something to note that even though he has the second, well, not second nuts, but low end straight, he still just check back here on the turn. Like, I think this sort of hand, again, sizing wise, I would make it bigger, but I think this sort of hand makes somewhat more sense in a way compared to those queen 9 off, king 9 off, that it still has better playability, but again, like, is this sort of, like, is this race for value? Is it for sort of hoping for villain to bluff fold, or that's somewhat unclear for me, at least. Of course, one of the good sides of having this sort of hands is that you basically get bit more board coverage for different sort of boards, that your range in this situation can then hit more easily, but I think that's not going to be good enough, because you still have, like, for example, King 10 type of hands that you can definitely raise for value, be dominating hands that are likely limp calling and so on. Yeah, we could make bit smaller as well here. Extremely dry flop, but definitely c-betting, and this is actually kind of interesting situation, that because once the villain limp calls on the flop, it will decrease usually AX type of hands. So how much fold equity we actually have here, and if we bet here like half pot or something and face shove, it's going to be really awkward situation. So I think there is some merit in going either way. So we bet 300, will lane actually min raises. So I wouldn't usually expect fold equity at this point. And we can definitely still just call and try to hit our outs. But hero goes for shove here. Well, of course, if we have like something like ace queen plus or so, we can probably go for a shove here, but again, I wouldn't expect villain to fold, but well, he actually did. So yeah, that's the thing, that like on the turn, if the villain shoves here, we would have like 900 call for pot of, what were the stacks at beginning, pot of 3000. So we would need like 30% equity, and we had basically like 9 outs to, or it's actually questionable if we can count the queen necessarily as out, but let's say 8 outs to flush and 10 6 outs, so 14 outs maybe. So it's going to be the absolute break-even point pretty much. So yeah, I think on the turn you can check, maybe go for check shove and give him the possibility that if he has some sort of float type of hands, he can then bluff with those. Well, he did bluff anyway, but that's rarely going to happen. Or if you bet, then you should probably go for like 300 at least and be ready to call the shove. So yeah, I think formation of the range against those ranges, limpings, I would change it somewhat, and sizings in general somewhat bigger would be better. And for 3-betting, I would say that the standard sizing without antes would be the 3x without extremely deep stacks, and maybe you can go like bit below 3x if you go to like bit over 20 big blind deep or so, or less than 30 big blind deep. But basically I wouldn't use like 2.5 5x 3-bet sizes, because at that point villain gets like 1.5 big blind, or I mean, if villain win raise and we make it like 5 big blind, it's going to be 3 big blind. 3 big blind to call for 10 big blind pot from position, so it's going to be too cheap overall. So yeah, I don't know any questions from the people watching. Are there some points that you want to still go through? I think we can go one hand history, for example, and let's take, for example, that has one hand. Oh yeah, I have the filter, so that's why it has one hand. Okay, I think I'll go through this one if there's not any specific questions. This would be a reasonable check raise candidate, but against 2.2x bots, it would be pretty crazy play. And yeah, I would just fold here against almost bot choice. Don't bet. We might be good, but huge amount. So for example, this sort of hand I would sometimes use as raise against the limp personally, because one thing I tend to want to when I raise against the limps is that I have the possibility to get a good amount of stronger hands to fold with my initial raise, and if you use sort of those queen 9 type of hands, that's pretty much or really rarely going to happen. So this in here will lane makes again big sizing. I would call here. We have seen a lot of big sizings from this guy, and we have mid pair plus cuts, so folding would be too weak. And I would just check here and most often and give hope that he tries to bluff, but it's not actually horrible to just donk bet like 200 and hope that he bluff catches. Because yeah, if he checks back this sort of hand on the river, it's kind of bad. So yeah, we can definitely, but the thing is that if we want to bluff here, I think we want to use pretty big sizing, so at least 200, but we can also go for like over bet if we want like 400, because we are basically representing that we have pretty much the 7x. So I would either check or go for big bet. I don't really like small bets that much. And this is kind of close that to be big enough AX that I would start to use as value raise against the limp. Yeah, checking here is fine, especially with the small hearts. We can then have some of the AXs in our checking range, and definitely calling here. And well, it's tough to get value, but I mean, we kind of almost have to value bet in my opinion. But the hands that we try to get value from would be like some 4x, 7x, king high type of hand. So I think we want to use like half pot or so. This is type of hand that we could also open fold, but I don't mind opening. I would probably use this as delayed c-bet sometimes, in a way that we can definitely get some of the better hands to fold. And when he checks twice here, it tends to decrease quite a lot of those pair type of hands. But at this point, I think just checking and hoping that the check high is the best option. So here again, we could sometimes go for raise. And donk betting or leading tier is not actually that bad. One thing to note here is that this isn't actually the first time that he has gone for big overbet in this sort of situation. So if we actually have at some point really strong hand after we have, like if we had flush here, I think actually looking to check raise would be kind of reasonable. Of course, I don't know if we, like against this sizing, if we had like 6 high flush here, should we be check raising or check calling? I don't know about that really, but because basically this sort of sizing should be extremely polarized. So probably just calling would be the reasonable way at least. Yeah, I don't mind calling here when we have the jack of diamond. But yeah, here I think we mainly have to fold. I suppose bluff shoving would have some merit. We are still blocking some of the 2 pairs and we have the flush blocker, so I don't know about calling because I think he just has too much of the value hands that beat us. Yeah, one thing why I really haven't played turbo heads up SNCs pretty much never ever is that I think it's kind of boring in a way to be playing, because these games can take quite a lot of time, I would say, and it's just going to be double the amount of buy-in minus the rake, so I don't know, for me it has personally always been that I prefer like hypers or unibet style, that it starts 33 big blind. I think this would be a reasonable spot to be bluffing sometimes, like 120 bet here with the gut shot. And against 40 we can't really fold because we have the gut shot and possibility to hit the second pair, so against that sizing I would just check call. But of course we would prefer, like here on the turn, we would prefer to have like a 9 jack with heart, 1 heart for example to bluff, because then we can more happily bluff on the river if the flush completes.
with the flush blocker as well. But the thing is that really many people, at least from my experience, they tend to see bet flop really often with the flush draws. So even if we don't have the blocker against the flush, like if we bet here with lane call and the river is hard, I think we can still quite effectively bluff, even if theory-wise we are probably somewhat over bluffing at that point. Well, 7-4 is crappy hand, but still against min 3 bet I wouldn't fold if I raise. And here we definitely want to check, in my opinion, and probably make that hero call if he bombs the river again. Even though it's not going to be great if he makes like 3x pot here, but I mean he has done that sort of play really often, and when we make pot size bet here, how often we actually get called by weaker. But let's see what happens. He calls. Well, he calls with the 6, so who knows. I don't know, maybe he would use that as bluff if we check as well. So, but in general, if I try to value bet the river with this low flush, I would use like min bet, but most often just check so that I have some solid bluff catcher in the check calling range. And in here we can go either way, c bet small or check back. And in here I would actually c bet pretty often to deny some equity. We have the best hand so often. And well, yeah, I suppose we can argue about making when we have the not high hand. Value bet on the river. Yeah, folding that is pretty weak. And that one as well. Against min raise I would pretty much, against some passive opponents, or well, this guy is quite passive I suppose, but yeah, I would just give up here without any real equity, and now checking and hoping we are sometimes good. So yeah, bigger sizing pre. Well, I think this was actually the sort of interesting hand that we were checking before. Well, this is clear check back, because well, you really don't want to get check raised here. And one thing to note also here is that you have the king, so it will give some extra equity on like queen or ace or 9 turns. So I would just check here and look to bluff catch good amount of turns if they will lane bet. And also one thing to note here, that even though we min bet the flop, it will decrease some of the total air hand. So if he calls here, it's a bit more likely that he actually has something compared to if we check behind. So it's going to be a lot tougher for us to be basically bluff catching on the further streets, even if he just calls here, compared to if we check behind. Because then if we check here, he gets with wider range on the turn, and we can bluff catch a bit better. And that would have been check raise. Usually I would lead here really often, again against this guy, considering his tendency to make those big bets. Sometimes I would also consider about
just checking turn and checking river even. But main thing here should be value bet as default, and I would use bigger sizing like 80 or so. And if we had made a bit bigger on the turn, we could then go a bit bigger on the river as well. But basically here, like if the villain has king, I think he often might call even over shove. And it's kind of bored that, well, I don't think villain should be main often checking the 9x, but he might even hero core 5x type of hand against pot size or something. But yeah, I think that sizing is decent anyway. And 8-10 I would personally open shove, because like if we look about Nash ranges, it would be up to, well, 17.5 big blind, so we can definitely shove like 8 big blind deep profitably. And limp calling doesn't really make any sense, and limp folding is a bit weak. Yeah, I would just bet the flop or make delayed bet here. Or bluff the river. I don't think we have enough showdown value to check this in the long run. And that was the end of it. So yeah, I think the hero game was decently solid overall. I would think about those 3-betting ranges against the limping, but I think like post flop, how hero checked most of the hands, and c-betting was, at least for me, quite good looking. So I think that side doesn't necessarily, or isn't the biggest concern at this point, but I would think about those, mainly those pre-flop 3-bet ranges, sizings, and so on. So hopefully people watching this got something out of it, some points on when to c-bet and not, and if you have any comments, you can also always use the YouTube video commenting and ask anything, and click the like button if you like the content, and subscribe for the channel. But yeah, thanks for this, and bye for now.